Welcome back to the Dynasty Files. In Part 1, we saw how Britain weaponized opium to reverse the silver drain, how Lin Zexu destroyed over 1,000 tons of the drug at Humen, and how iron warships obliterated the Qing's wooden junks. Now, the British fleet sits before the gates of Nanjing, and the real devastation is about to begin. The Treaty of Nanjing, a death sentence for an era. August 1842. The Yangtze River, the most sacred artery of Chinese civilization, lay silent beneath the shadow of British warships. HMS Cornwallis sat anchored like an immovable steel fortress. The sky over Nanjing hung gray and heavy as the spirits of the Qing officials stepping aboard. Qi Ying and Yilibu, two grand ministers entrusted by Emperor Daoguang, walked with trembling steps. Their silk court robes, embroidered with dragons and phoenixes, still shimmered brilliantly, but their shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of humiliation. This was not a diplomatic visit. This was the execution of an empire's honor. Across from them, Sir Henry Pottinger stood upright. No kneeling, no tributary ceremony, no raising your face to receive celestial grace. He stood there, representing the rising new power, looking down upon the celestial empire with the eyes of a conqueror. August 29, 1842. White paper laid out. The trembling brush of the Qing minister touched down. Each drop of ink seeping into paper was a knife thrust into the empire's heart. The Treaty of Nanjing was born, the first unequal treaty in Chinese history, opening the era that future generations would call by a name that cuts to the bone: Baiyan Guochi, a century of national humiliation. The first clause, an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. Let that number sink in. 21 million silver dollars at that time equaled 1/3 of the court's total annual revenue. Of this, 6 million, compensation for the opium Lin Zexu destroyed. 3 million, debts owed by Kohong merchants. 12 million, British military expenses. The invaded paying the invader to cover the cost of invading them. Like having your house robbed, then being forced to pay for the robber's gas money home. If there were an award for brazenness in international relations, this clause would win unanimously. The indemnity dealt a fatal blow to an already depleted economy. To pay the debt, the court was forced to raise taxes, pushing millions of farmers into destitution. The last silver coins flowed across the border. Levees, already severely deteriorated from lack of maintenance funding, continued unrepaired. Floods ravaged the Yellow River and Yangtze valleys. Famine gripped multiple provinces. Meanwhile, taxes grew heavier, corruption deepened, suffering intensified. A spiral driving the Qing ever faster toward the abyss. But money, however precious, paled beside territorial sovereignty. The next clause, cede Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. Lord Palmerston called it a barren island with hardly a house upon it. But the Royal Navy saw something different. One of the world's finest natural deep-water harbors, positioned at the gateway to southern China. A strategically perfect base for controlling all Far Eastern trade. A rough diamond in a shell of rock. For the first time in 1,000 years of history, ancestral land was severed and handed to foreigners. The Union Jack rose over Victoria Peak. Hong Kong, from a humble fishing village, gradually became a military base under British hands, then a thriving commercial center. But that prosperity was built upon the pain of separation. It took 155 years until July 1, 1997, for the Chinese flag to fly over Hong Kong again. That day, hundreds of millions of Chinese wept before their television screens. Not tears of joy, but tears because the most painful scar had finally been stitched closed. Then 5 ports were forced open: Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai. The Kohong system, the only tool for controlling foreign trade, was abolished entirely. British merchants traded freely with anyone at any port. Cheap manufactured textiles from Manchester flooded in, strangling millions of domestic artisans. Shanghai, once a quiet fishing town, rapidly transformed into an international concession where Chinese law held no authority, where foreigners built their own world on Chinese soil. But the Treaty of Nanjing was merely the opening shot. In 1843, the supplementary Treaty of the Bogue introduced 2 legal concepts that would chain China for a century. 2 invisible shackles heavier than any iron manacles. First, extraterritoriality. British subjects who committed crimes on Chinese soil were not tried by Chinese law, but by British courts. A drunken sailor who beat a poor man to death in a Guangzhou market in front of hundreds of witnesses went unpunished, escorted back to a warship. Typical outcome? A light sentence or acquittal. Chinese lives on their own soil were worth less than a hair on a foreigner's head. Judicial sovereignty, the foundation of any nation, simply vanished. Second, most favored nation status. Any privilege China granted to any country in the future would automatically extend to Britain, without negotiation, without reciprocation. This clause transformed China into an all-you-can-eat buffet for the imperial powers. Britain used guns to open ports. America and France walked in behind them. France demanded missionary rights. Britain and Russia got them too. The powers didn't need to compete with each other to carve up China. They cooperated, using most favored nation clauses to ensure the spoils were always evenly divided. Dao Guang sat in silence for hours in the Forbidden City upon receiving the final treaty. He believed concessions would buy peace. He was wrong. Concessions don't satisfy predators. They only whet the appetite. And the most damning detail? The Treaty of Nanjing never mentioned opium. The cause of the war, the black mud killing millions, was completely ignored. Opium continued flowing in greater quantities than ever. China didn't just lose land and money. It continued losing its people in the black smoke of white death. The Treaty of Nanjing was the first domino to fall, triggering a chain of rebellions, invasions, and upheavals that would shake China throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The world looked at China with different eyes. No longer a mighty empire, but the sick man of East Asia, a humiliating phrase that the powers used openly. The Eastern Dragon, once the bestower of celestial grace, had become prey for a wolf pack. The Palace in Flames, the greatest cultural crime of the 19th century. 14 years after the Treaty of Nanjing, the ink on the paper hadn't dried before blood was about to flow again. The interval between the 2 wars, from 1842 to 1856, was not true peace. It was a false peace, the calm before the storm. The British were not satisfied with 5 open ports. They wanted all of China. The Chinese seethed with resentment. Both sides waited for a pretext. The pretext came from an incident so trivial that, had it not led to war, no one would remember it. The Arrow, a small trading vessel, registered in Hong Kong but with an expired license, crewed entirely by Chinese, was moored at Guangzhou. Qing officials boarded and arrested 12 sailors suspected of piracy. In the process, according to the British, though the Chinese denied it, the British flag on the vessel was pulled down. For the Qing, routine law enforcement on their own territory. For London, an insult to an imperial symbol. A small match tossed into a powder keg packed tight for 14 years. This time, Britain didn't go alone. Napoleon III's Second French Empire used the execution of Father Auguste Chapdelaine in Guangxi as its pretext. Two of Europe's most powerful nations joined hands, not in friendship, but because both saw opportunity. The Second Opium War, also called the Arrow War, was far more devastating than the first. If the previous war was fought along the southern coast, this time the target was the Celestial Empire's heart, Beijing. The Battle of Balakiao in 1860 buried the last hope forever. 30,000 Manchu-Mongol cavalry, descendants of Genghis Khan, charged screaming into the Allied lines. The thundering of hooves shook the earth, but what answered was not swords, but bullets tearing through the air and shells exploding amidst formations. In less than 5 hours, the cavalry was annihilated. Anglo-French soldiers watched in astonishment as Manchu warriors charged to their dying breath, but none reached the enemy ranks. Their bravery only deepened the tragedy of defeat. Beijing lay wide open. Emperor Xianfeng, young and feeble, fled the capital to Rehe, claiming he was going on an autumn hunt. The Son of Heaven abandoning his capital, an act that completely shattered imperial credibility. And here, one of the greatest cultural crimes in human history took place. Yuanmingyuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness. An architectural complex spanning over 3.5 square kilometers, built continuously over 150 years by 3 emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. It combined the finest essence of Chinese garden art with Western Baroque architecture designed by Jesuit missionaries. Thousands of rooms, dreamy artificial lakes, arched bridges spanning streams, artificial mountains draped in greenery, and, most importantly, the largest treasure collection in the world at that time. Tang and Song dynasty paintings, gold-plated Buddha statues, the most exquisite porcelain across all dynasties, calligraphy manuscripts that history could never duplicate. The Siku Chuanshu, China's greatest encyclopedia. Yuanmingyuan was the soul and intellect of Chinese civilization, materialized in precious wood, marble, and gold. October 1860. Anglo-French forces entered. First, curiosity. Then, greed. Then, a frenzy of looting erupted. Western soldiers, self-proclaimed representatives of civilization, tore precious silk curtains to make bags for gold and silver, smashed priceless porcelain vases just to extract embedded gems. French General Montauban confessed, "In my wildest imagination, I could not have conceived the splendor of this place, until I saw it being destroyed." But the looting wasn't the worst of it. Lord Elgin, the British commander, ordered Yuanmingyuan burned to the ground. The official reason? Retaliation for the Qing's imprisonment and killing of British envoys. The true purpose? To strike directly at the emperor personally, to make him understand that even his most sacred place was not safe from the British Empire. October 18th, 1860. 3,500 British soldiers set the fires. Flames erupted violently from the structures of precious wood. Black smoke rose so high it obscured the Beijing sky. Even from the Forbidden City, one could see ash falling like black butterflies. 3 days and 3 nights. The dreamy lake waters reflected the fiery red glow of destruction. Marble cracked from the heat. Yuanmingyuan, symbol of Kangxi Qianlong prosperity, was reduced to rubble and ash. What was stolen never returned. To this day, artifacts from Yuanmingyuan are scattered across museums and private collections worldwide. The British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the auction houses of Christie's and Sotheby's. 12 bronze animal heads from the Imperial fountain, each representing one sign of the Chinese zodiac, were looted and dispersed around the world. Over 150 years later, China had to spend tens of millions of dollars to buy them back one by one at international auction houses. Each time a Yuanmingyuan artifact appears at auction, it isn't just an antique. It is evidence from the greatest robbery in history, reminding China of an unhealed wound. The French writer Victor Hugo, from his place of exile, wrote a furious letter that every Chinese schoolchild knows by heart today. 2 bandits broke in. One looted, the other set fire. One calls itself France, the other calls itself England. Hugo added, "We call ourselves civilized and call them barbarians. Here, then, is what civilization has done to barbarism." Condemnation from a Westerner himself, but it changed nothing. Yuanmingyuan still burned, and burns forever in the nation's memory. Burning Yuanmingyuan was not a military act. It was a cultural execution. It marked the complete spiritual collapse of the Manchu Qing dynasty. If the Son of Heaven couldn't protect his ancestors' palace, what could he protect? Xianfeng in Rehe, drowning in fury and alcohol. When news of Yuanmingyuan's burning reached him, they say he vomited blood upon hearing it. The Son of Heaven dared not return to Beijing, dared not look upon the ashes of his ancestors' palace. He died in 1861, at age 30, too young to die, but old enough to have witnessed everything crumble around him. The throne passed to Zai Chun, a 5-year-old child, and real power fell to Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who would dominate China for nearly half a century. Xianfeng's brother, Prince Gong, was forced to sign the Convention of Beijing. The Nanjing humiliation was doubled, massive additional indemnities. Kowloon, the land facing Hong Kong, ceded to Britain. Interior ports along the Yangtze forced open. And most painfully, opium was officially legalized across the entire territory. Chains on the dragon's neck. When sovereignty was carved up with ink. We tend to tell wars through battles. Humen, Zhenqiang, Baliqiao. But the real pain of a nation sometimes lies not in the roar of cannons, but in the terrifying silence of negotiation rooms, where sovereignty is carved away piece by piece with pen, ink, and the cold smile of the victor. After 2 wars, the Qing was bound by a system of unequal treaties, each strand a legal clause, each knot a piece of sovereignty stripped away. Calling them treaties was ironic. Treaties are agreements between equal parties. These were terms imposed by victors upon the vanquished, at gunpoint, aboard warships. The legal chains already discussed, extraterritoriality, most favored nation status, were no longer just words on paper. They had burrowed deep into daily life, turning Chinese people into second-class citizens in their own country. In the mixed courts of Shanghai, foreign judges sat in higher chairs than Chinese ones. Foreigners who committed serious crimes, murder, assault, typically received light sentences or acquittals. Meanwhile, Chinese who violated concession regulations could be publicly beaten in the streets. Tariff sovereignty was also stripped. Import duties were fixed at an absurdly low 5%, and the court could not change them without the power's consent. To ensure war indemnities were paid, Britain forced the Qing to hand customs administration to foreigners. Robert Hart, a Briton, served as Inspector General of Chinese Customs for nearly half a century, from 1863 to 1911. The empire's most important revenue agency, run by the enemy. Tax money flowed into foreign pockets before reaching the imperial treasury. A dark irony. An empire that called itself the center of the universe had its purse strings managed by barbarians. With record-low tariffs, European manufactured goods flooded the Chinese market. Machine-woven textiles from Manchester, cheaper, more durable, more attractive than hand-woven cloth, killed millions of traditional artisan weavers. Iron goods, glassware, soap, matches, each one infiltrated daily life, replacing domestic products. Millions of small traders went bankrupt, falling into poverty. The domestic production that had been self-sufficient for 1,000 years, China's pride, the very thing that had led Qianlong to declare he needed nothing from outside, was systematically destroyed within decades. Then the concessions sprang up, patches of land in the heart of Chinese cities, but entirely beyond the court's control. Shanghai, Tianjin, Hangzhou, areas with their own police, courts, taxes, and European architecture. If we compare them to today, the concessions resembled 19th century versions of special economic zones, except instead of Chinese self-governance, they were administered by foreign law on Chinese soil. In Shanghai, parks in the concession area had regulations barring Chinese entry. Folk tradition records a sign reading, "Dogs and Chinese not admitted." And while some historians debate the exact wording, the discriminatory nature is undeniable. In their own country, their own people ranked alongside dogs, barred from the finest district of the very city where they lived. War indemnities weighed heavily, like being forced to sign a predatory loan agreement, compound interest piling up for 40 years. To pay foreign creditors, the court squeezed its people dry. Levees unrepaired, floods came, food shortages, hunger spread. Resentment aimed not only at foreign invaders, but directly at the weak Manchu Qing dynasty. Perhaps the heaviest chain wasn't on paper, but in the psyche. After 1860, the Qing court completely lost its celestial confidence. A new institution was established, the Zhongli Yamen, a proto-foreign ministry, but created not for proactive diplomacy, but to placate and appease Western demands. China transformed from a self-sufficient empire at the center of the world into a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society. On the surface, the emperor still sat on the golden throne. Officials still wore court robes performing ancient rituals. But in reality, every tax payment bore the shadow of foreign creditors. Every port flew foreign flags. Every legal verdict required consular approval. An empire in name, but real sovereignty lay in others' hands. But, and this is history's most wondrous paradox, from the depths of despair, the seeds of awakening germinated. A visionary few began to realize, without change, without learning Western techniques to defeat the West, China would vanish from the map. A century of shame and the Dragon's Awakening. When the ashes of Yuanmingyuan cooled, a new chapter began. The most devastating, most painful in Chinese history. It would be called Bai Nian Guoqu, the century of national humiliation, counted from the first gunshots in 1840 to the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. 109 years. Not a number on a timeline, an open wound, a collective trauma that has shaped how the Chinese see the world to this very day. The first awakening came from the deepest pain. Wei Yuan, a scholar with vision ahead of his time, wrote the illustrated treatise on the maritime kingdoms immediately after the first defeat. For the first time, a Chinese intellectual acknowledged that the world beyond was not barbarian darkness. Wei Yuan coined the guiding principle for decades to come. Learn the superior techniques of the barbarians in order to control them. That phrase contained an unprecedented, painful admission. For the first time, the Chinese accepted that they were no longer the world's teachers. They had to become students. And cruelly, students of the very people who had brought cannons to destroy their home. But awakening is never a straight line. While the court fumbled with half-hearted reforms, the ground beneath China shook. The Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest civil war in human history, with over 20 million dead, more than World War I, erupted as a direct consequence of the economic and spiritual collapse following the Opium War. The self-strengthening movement, military modernization, from 1860 to 1890 brought some changes. Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzan, Zuo Zongtang, towering figures of the late Qing, led modernization efforts. The first steam-powered shipyard rose in Shanghai. The Jiangnan Arsenal became China's most modern weapons factory. Western-style cannons were cast in Nanjing. Telegraph lines connected major cities. And the Beiyang Fleet was born, one of Asia's most powerful naval forces, possessing 2 German-built ironclads that were among the world's most modern at the time of their launch. On paper, the Chinese Navy was stronger than Japan's. On the surface, the Qing appeared to be rising. The self-strengthening motto proclaimed, "Chinese learning as the foundation, Western learning for practical use." Sounds reasonable, but it was the most sophisticated self-deception, believing you could purchase technology without changing the system that produced it. Like buying a smartphone but refusing to connect to the internet, the shell without the soul. It was a revival built on sand. The old arrogance lurked beneath new-style uniforms. The bureaucracy remained rotten. Empress Dowager Cixi diverted naval budget funds to rebuild the summer palace for her personal pleasure. Modern warships loaded with counterfeit gunpowder, soldiers without fighting spirit. The Beiyang Fleet, pride of the self-strengthening movement, was completely annihilated in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 by a Japan far smaller but reformed thoroughly from the roots through the Meiji Restoration. Defeat at the hands of Japan, the little brother in the celestial order, the island nation China had regarded as an obedient student, was 100 times more shocking than defeat by Britain. Losing to Britain could be blamed on barbarian technology, but losing to Japan, an Asian nation, sharing Chinese characters, sharing the Confucian tradition, left no excuse. Japan had proven that only thorough reform from the roots, constitution, parliament, mass education, professional military, was the way forward. The Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, signed with Japan, was even more humiliating than Nanjing. Taiwan was ceded, 200 million taels of silver in indemnities. Korea lost entirely. Pain piled upon pain. Liang Qichao, a young man who had passed the traditional Confucian civil service examinations in his youth, raised in the classical tradition, but whose pain over his nation's fall transformed him from a Confucian scholar into an intellectual revolutionary. He wrote about the new citizen, the new type of person China needed to survive. No longer subjects kneeling before the Son of Heaven, but citizens with rights, responsibilities, and critical thinking. In 1898, the 100 Days Reform, Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao persuaded Emperor Guangxu to implement radical reforms modeled on Japan's Meiji Restoration. Establish a parliament, modernize education, reform the military, abolish the imperial examination system. 100 days of reform. Only 100 days. Empress Dowager Cixi staged a coup, imprisoned Guangxu in the palace, and executed 6 reform leaders. History remembers them as the 6 gentlemen of the 100 days. The last chance to save the Qing through peaceful reform, strangled by those who held power. Then in 1900, the Boxer Uprising, a peasant movement against foreigners, driven by the belief that charms and traditional martial arts could withstand artillery, erupted. Cixi supported them, thinking she could harness popular fury to expel the foreigners. The result? The 8-nation alliance invaded Beijing for the second time. The Forbidden City was occupied. Cixi fled, disguised as a peasant, riding an ox cart out of the capital. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, equivalent to 4 years of government revenue, to be paid over 39 years with interest. Humiliation upon humiliation. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution broke out. Puyi, the last emperor, a 6-year-old child, was forced to abdicate. The curtain fell on over 2,000 years of feudal monarchy. But the Qing's collapse didn't bring immediate peace. It opened an era of warlordism, endless civil war, and then an invasion more brutal than anything the Opium Wars had delivered. Imperial Japan's massacre at Nanjing, the occupation of Manchuria, turning China into a battlefield for 8 years. The race among great powers to control the world's destiny has never stopped. Opium has disappeared, but new forms of domination, technology, finance, information, are infinitely more sophisticated. The question the Opium Wars posed nearly 200 years ago still echoes. When a civilization closes itself off from the world, when it refuses to change, when it believes it has achieved perfection, what happens? The Opium Wars left a lesson not just for China, but for all humanity. That lesson cuts like a double-edged blade. On one side, no empire, however wealthy, can survive if it shuts itself off from progress, sleeps on past glory, and refuses to face reality. Complacency born from success is the slowest but most certain poison. On the other, power never justifies crime. Cloaking the act of forcing a nation to consume poison in the language of free trade and civilization, then using military force when the victim dares to resist. The British won militarily, but the act of using violence to defend the right to poison a nation will remain an indelible stain forever. And yet, the Chinese lost militarily, but from the ashes, they found something more precious than any victory: the power of regeneration. Any nation that can survive a century of continuous humiliation and still rise, that nation possesses something no cannon can destroy: will. The awakening after the Opium Wars, though agonizingly painful, maddeningly slow, paid for with hundreds of millions of lives through war, famine, and revolution, was one of the most magnificent and most tragic transformations in human history. From the sick man of East Asia to the world's second-largest economy, that journey was no miracle. It was paid for in the bone and blood of generations. And in today's world, where technology, finance, and information have replaced opium as tools of domination, the question still rings. Who is the next complacent empire? And who is wrapping crime in the fine words of progress? Remember one final image. Human, June 1839. Over 1,000 tons of opium dissolving in quicklime. The pits boiling and churning, white smoke billowing. Lin Zexu standing on the raised platform, looking down. Face stern, eyes unshaking. He had won that battle, the only battle China won in the entire war. He had written a letter apologizing to the sea god for polluting the ocean. A man who apologized to the sea, while the empire he served crumbled around him. A man who saved millions of lives by destroying opium, then was exiled by the very court he had defended. A man who wrote to the Queen of England asking about conscience, while his adversary cared only about profit. Lin Zexu died in 1850 on the road back from Xinjiang, this time recalled to suppress the Taiping Rebellion. He never made it. The most incorruptible man in the empire died mid-journey between two impossible missions in a country that was falling apart. Perhaps that is the image that speaks most about the tragedy of the Qing dynasty. It was not a shortage of good people, nor a shortage of talented people. What was missing was a system, a world, willing to let the good and the talented prevail. Thank you for watching the Dynasty Files. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who loves history.